Hello everyone, I'm Chris Sullivan. I'll be your host for the latest installment in our Swiss Re Corporate Solutions Risk Management webinar series. I'm excited to welcome back Dr. Thomas Holzoy, Chief Economist and Head of Swiss Re Institute for the Americas, to discuss the fundamental restructuring in global supply chains. Today's talk will highlight the key findings from the most recent Swiss Re Institute Sigma publication titled De-risking Global Supply Chains. A link to that publication was provided in the invitation and will also be provided in our follow-up email. Before we get started, a few logistical reminders. The audience has been muted. Feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. We will, as we always do, address those at the end in a live Q&A session with Thomas. And if you encounter any technical issues, please press Control F5 to reset the platform. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Thomas Holzoy to walk us through today's discussion. Thomas?
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and welcome everybody on the line. Today I will talk about major trends in global supply chains and some of how they relate to the current crisis, and some of the backdrop or trends that have been going on for a longer while, and but of course primarily what is of interest is what do we expect for the future, and how this affects the global manufacturing, but then also the risk management landscape. So when we look back at supply chains and how they have developed into a very complex global system, China is at the core as a global manufacturing hub. These developments have been very much driven by goals of efficiency. So this global supply chain is honed to deliver the most efficient division of labor internationally. And now with there is a shift in focus to also include and increasingly recognize resilience as a main objective, and to look at and recognize and manage risks to the supply chain. So this is the key, what I want you to take away from this today. It's one of the concepts that we see happening in the supply chain, and the talk is about the creation of parallel supply chains, and is the concept of redundancy. And we know this from various areas, engineering, we know it from biology here, and what this is supposed to show you is a depiction of kidneys. So the principle is very simple. If you need something very urgently for your survival, it's 2 is better than 1. So that's the whole secret behind redundancy as a core concept, and that is part of what's happening with the emergence of parallel supply chains, and the evolution. There's another buzzword that is frequently labeled or used as label is the decoupling of the systems, a US-centric and a China-centric system, but it's more complex than that. So we move into the substance of these trends. As I mentioned, these have been going on for a while, and there is the underlying factors. Some of them, some of the core trends are economic, underlying drivers, and some of them are risks, and we have an increasing occurrence of disruptions to supply chains from catastrophes. But then also we have geopolitical changes, protectionism, trade wars, and so here's where the concept of decoupling plays in. All this has been going on, and but the COVID has really put the spotlight on these risks, on these trends, on the vulnerabilities, and this is driving changes that we believe will be more significant going forward than compared to what we have seen happening already in the recent past. So to step back again a little bit, looking at these underlying drivers, one of the driving forces for the offshoring and outsourcing to low-wage economies, and China was on the forefront of that, was the much availability of cheap labor in these locations, with the stronger increase of wages in China or in other emerging economies. Some of these wage differentials have started to erode, and that's something that has been going on for a while. Rising political risk, we don't need to discuss the origin of it. It's very clear going on. A lot of it has accelerated or strengthened post the financial crisis, where a lot of policy reactions were necessary, and governments were on call for helping their populations and their electorate out of the troubles coming out of the financial crisis. We have changing social values, and that's something tied also into supply chains. Consumers care more about the economic impact or footprint of supply chains, but then also labor conditions, diversity, and equality aspects, and so the supply chains are more under scrutiny in the context of ESG sensibilities. We have seen business interruptions due to catastrophes more often, and I just want to point out the year 2011, where we had the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, which has disrupted particularly the global car industry, with a lot of critical supplies coming from Japan, and the logistics disrupted from that catastrophe. That was early on in the year, and then a little later on, and lasting for over half a year, we had the floods in Thailand, which hit another global manufacturing hub in Thailand, this time more hitting the electronics industry, and both events had clearly highlighted the vulnerabilities and of supply chains for these various industries, and have led to production disruptions throughout the world from events that happened on the other side of the globe. And then, a bit different in nature, but pointing out an ongoing trend that is enabling these the changes to the supply chain, which is technology. And we have robotics, 3D printing, digital manufacturing are allowing a different type of manufacturing, not so much economies of scale, where you run large volumes, and so economies of scale encouraging then the development of or creation of production plants with large scale in cheap and low cost locations. The modern technology is more flexible, and it makes it economies of scale go down in terms of as a driver for the business model. Labor costs go down because it's more capital intensive, and that allows to put less focus on labor costs, and on the other hand get closer to the customer, and also avoid these long transportation and delays from production far away in other parts of the world. As I mentioned, COVID was an accelerator. It did this through disruptions in the entire manufacturing sector. We have seen it in the automotive industry. We have seen it for other manufacturing sectors, electronics, consumer goods. But then another type of disruption and reaction was quite critical, and that relates to the pharmaceutical sector and the medical supply, where primarily there were disruptions of the manufacturing process itself, but then also the policy responses of the countries shutting down exports to and trying to redirect and prioritize production for their own population. And so this accelerates these trends, what we have seen, and ways how companies are reacting and try to add resilience to these complex supply chains is diversification. So that's the adding redundancy. You want more in terms of geography, more plants and not just one major production facility, multiple suppliers, multiple customers. So to add the concept of diversification also into the production process. So to be flexible and to be able to react if things go wrong, and not just optimize to the point of maximum efficiency. So these include then relocation of some of the manufacturing centers, and there are new countries. A lot of them are also in proximity to China. So a lot of the emerging Asian economies are potential candidates for relocation. But then also some of the manufacturing will come closer to the corporations or the main manufacturing companies or the hubs. That's reshoring or nearshoring. So shortening the supply chains will take out some of the risk, and it's also another aspect is to simplify, have less products, have less steps, and make supply chains more robust and more resilient that way. These are all risk mitigation tools. On top of that, there are also risk transfer solutions, and I will look at those a little bit later in my talk. So if you look now about these causes, the question of where will it go, which countries are involved, and which industries. And to look again back at the exposure, we'll see how integrated these global supply chains actually are. And if we look at the largest 20 economies of the world, and that's I'm showing this here on the left side of this graph, we see that for most of these large economies, somewhere between 40 and 60% of exports are related to supply chains, so to multiple steps. So it's either that exports from other countries have become part of these products and then get exported, or that these exports will will be re-exported then later by the receiving countries. So an indication for this highly integrated and interconnected nature of supply chains. I highlight here countries from the Americas, US and Canada, somewhere in the middle ground, and Mexico and Brazil, also very highly integrated in their trade. China is somewhere also in the middle here. In that respect, not an outlier in terms of the integration or the dependencies. China's role comes from its sheer size, and it shows it is integrated in relative terms, similar to other economies, but the sheer size of its manufacturing sector makes it critical, and it's a manufacturing hub for the rest of the world. And we see that here on the right side chart, where we see the role of Chinese intermediate inputs as a percent of global production for all other countries. And we see here that for computer and electronic equipment, textiles, and base metals, a lot of these the equipment goes into manufacturing. China is one of the main suppliers and plays a major role as at the moment as a manufacturing hub for the rest of the world. And for that reason, economic but also geopolitical trends relating to China play a major role for the trends that we are observing and predicting going forward. So I mentioned that these trends, the driving factors for shifting from a pure efficiency focus to a broader based, including resilience, has been going on for a while, and this ties into a trend of globalization and global trade having peaked basically a decade ago with the global financial crisis. And so we can see this in these metrics here, that various measures like merchandise trade in relation to GDP, but then which also includes all types of exports and imports, but then also the share of value chain related, so multi-step type of trade as part of exports. Both these measures have moved pretty much in sync and have peaked around the financial crisis and have then gradually come down since. And one of the big changes that took place there is the rise of protectionism, and this has been going further back, or this has been on the increase as a policy reaction to the financial crisis, way before we had the US-Chinese trade war heating up. And it's not all tariffs. There's a lot of non-tariff restrictions that are being put in place by many governments across the world, and overall the protectionism has become a headwind to growth in exports and value chains. Another one of these factors that I mentioned was the pure economic, the cost arbitrage aspect. If we showing here on the left side chart wages for manufacturing, hourly wages average, and for once we see the US is on the right, we have China on the very left of that chart. This large discrepancy is the key driver for offshoring. And what we see here is that the wage growth in China has been strong, and so some of these the relative advantage has narrowed. The other aspect, what I'm showing here, with looking at the wages in alternative countries, Mexico, which is tied to the U.S. through a free trade agreement, so has a preferential status as supplier in that respect, and we have a much less pronounced wage increase in Mexico. So the relative attractiveness of alternative locations has increased. Yeah, and I'm showing also as a alternative in Asia, Vietnam, even lower level and much less of an increase of the wages there. So the economics, the cost arbitrage for offshoring, the economics improve or make, in relative terms, make Mexico and Vietnam, and just examples here, makes it more attractive, and China less attractive as a location. So moving on, we have tried to quantify what we foresee as a plausible outcome from these considerations to make supply chains more resilient. There are various surveys that of manufacturing companies from either European or US or Asian, mature Asia background, that we're producing in China, and these surveys indicate their plans, the willingness, and the existing plans to relocate, and we have tried to translate these survey results and various economic factors into a scenario of supply chain shifts that I will be talking about going forward. So one question is which sectors or types of industries are most inclined or most incentivized or most likely to move. And for that, we tap into some research done by McKinsey, and they differentiate here, and this is what we have showed before, in very different types or nature of driving factors. And the one are purely economic, and the wage differential is one of them. Quality of infrastructure plays a role, but then also the nature of the production of the industry itself. Is it very labor intensive or is it capital intensive? And so capital intensive industries are not as likely to move for two reasons. For one, the labor cost is less of a share of the expenses, plays a smaller role, and then the other reason is that it's more difficult to move. It needs to set up specific plants. It requires much larger investments, and again, we're talking here about value chain, so very specific inputs. So they are not as easy to repurpose. So these are all very specific to one company, one type of product, the investments, and so there's not as much flexibility. So if we just look at economic factors alone, then we see that industries like textile, apparel are very likely to be affected: furniture and some standard computer and electronic equipment, and for entertainment and so on. So these types, and these are trends that where the alternative locations have grown, and this trend has been going on already for a while. So this is again, as I said before, the peak of globalization with China at the center goes back more than 10 years with the financial crisis, and so some of the diminishing cost arbitrage or cost benefits from China has led companies to look for alternative locations, a lot in Asia already for a while. Now, the other type of factors, the non-economic factors, they tie more into geopolitical risks, protectionism, the trade war, and here we see a bit of a different game. And so it's it's strategic products and that are more in the focus here. And they are in the they are at the center of protectionist measures in the trade war. We see tariffs on different types of products, and this the automotive industry plays a bigger role here, and critical electronic equipment in the telecommunication. Just think about 5G telecom. And how much here this technology has become core and center of trade war and of geopolitical tension. So these critical industries have much more of a motivation or a bigger push based on the non-economic drivers, and that's what has clearly accelerated in the last few years with the trade war, and now finally with COVID, the pharmaceuticals and the medical supply chain has become COVID has put a spotlight on this industry as a critical industry, and protectionist measures around medical supply chain are have already taken place as an immediate reaction, but the industry will react to this going forward in response to this the realization of these critical industries and policy responses across the world. So it's not just the traditional the mature economies or the traditional manufacturing domiciles, but emerging economies have reacted in similar ways as well. So these are industries that have a big weight and have a big motivation push either on the non-economic factors or non-economic drivers. But that was a global view. If you think about China specifically, and there is again a focus on China because of the geopolitical situation and the decoupling between let's say U.S. and the Chinese sphere of influence. So we put a specific emphasis in our considerations on China as the manufacturing hub, and we look at the reaction to relocating manufacturing capacity out of China. So what is the role of China specifically with the U.S. trade? And so that ties directly into the exposure to the U.S. Trade tensions. And here we see that of Chinese exports, the top industries that go to the US are telecom equipment, office equipment, electrical machinery, apparel and furniture again, and so these are that ties into the picture from the prior slide. Now, interesting is the question of who would step in. Yeah, so if there's trade war specific between the US and China, this will create an incentive to look for, or the necessity to look for alternative locations, and some of these industries are labor intensive, so there will be a strong incentive to continue to produce in a low-cost environment or location. And so this is what we look at here on the right chart, where we see for some of the core industries that I just mentioned, at the core of reconsidering the supply chain: clothing, telecom, electrical machinery, furniture. The right chart shows the countries that have the most similar structure of their exports, the most similar types of products. So indicating the capability and an industry structure that is most likely to be able to be upscaled, and then step in to take on and grow the production if this gets moved out from China. And there are the countries that are emerging Asian countries. They are in the proximity: Vietnam, India, Korea, and Thailand here, Malaysia. So not just emerging economies, but also the highly industrialized Korea is on here as locations with similar industry structures. But then, of course, also we have our neighbors, Mexico and Canada, show up here, tied into with free trade agreements and with much shorter supply chains, which are, of course, another main economic driver and a benefit in terms of location. So this gives us a bit of an image of what types of products will most likely be affected, and which alternative locations would benefit. So again, we developed. So these are the moving parts. We try to put them together in a scenario, and we try to quantify what is most likely to happen based on the expressed, and we looked at the survey results where we looked at what companies that manufacture in China right now are planning to do, and we came up with this scenario that shows where we quantify or assume some $200 billion of exports to be shifted from China to other locations, and this is equivalent to 20% of China's value-related exports. And then we also thought that there will be a further 10%, or roughly $100 billion worth of exports that will be reshored and will be produced in the home countries of these manufacturing centers. So these are the immediate effects. These are quite substantial amounts of production. So this will not happen overnight. So we assume that this probably will take a period of 5 years, and over this period of 5 years, this will increase growth in these regions or in these countries, and for once through the gradual increase of exports, part of GDP in these countries. But then also, of course, there is the necessity to build the capacity first. And we have looked at the average capital to output ratios that make sense, and come up with a total investment of roughly 700 billion that is necessary to create this 300 billion worth of manufacturing capacity in different locations. So this altogether boosts growth, and we think about a boost for these relocation countries, where exports will move from China then to Vietnam, Thailand, the countries that we have shown before. And for these mostly emerging economies, this adds up to 0.7% of GDP growth in this transition period. So quite a substantial impact, because these are large investments, and in adding to a relatively smaller base. For the reshoring countries, again, we assume a volume here of 100 billion. It will also have a positive effect on growth. We just assume the G7 countries as the matches the most of the manufacturing capacity and most of the value-related imports. Can add maybe 0.2% to GDP growth to those countries over the transition period. A much smaller effect because of the much larger base for these countries. So it's important to note that for these, there's an important assumption behind these effects, these positive effects of growth during the transition, and it's a positive effect globally if China reacts with policy measures to offset the loss of manufacturing of export capacity. And we assume that this is most likely to happen because it fits into the Chinese policy mix anyway. There's a reorientation of the Chinese economy from export-driven growth and manufacturing, export-driven to a more dependent on the global economy to a more self-sufficient and more domestic, more consumer-driven economy. That's this shift also came out of the global financial crisis, where there were vulnerabilities exposed, but it's repeatedly expressed in new plans, and so it fits into this policy shift. And then also China's policy, economic policies, is very efficient in the past in managing towards its growth targets. So we would expect that there would be a policy reaction to keep to isolate the Chinese economy from negative effects. So there would be actually a net positive for the global economy, a positive effect for the relocation and reshoring countries, and the negative effects in China most likely offset by policy measures. So let's step back and look at again what what we are describing here. So there's a reaction to supply chain risks, and they are mentioned a couple of those: catastrophes. We have the potential failure to infrastructure, communication, cyber risks come in here. We have interruption in financing, so some of these can be political risks, some of these could be a financial crisis, some of these interruption in financing can be a reaction to a global economic recession, where risk appetite for funding emerging economies is going down, regulatory and political risks. So we have seen this variety of disruptions. Some of this played out again with COVID or with the trade war rather recently. Some of them have these exposures have materialized over the last decade in various instances. There's a bunch of risk mitigation measures that I mentioned, and this relocation is one of the major ones that where a lot of in our scenario we talk about $1 trillion of GDP over this 5-year period that's being influenced or affected by this, and this makes the supply chain more resilient. There will be so that reduces the risk. It has implications for risk transfer and insurance relating to these $1 trillion of GDP. It creates additional income and demand, but then also there is a lot of investment. There's a whole range of engineering, credit surety related and construction related insurance during the construction and build-up phase. There's infrastructure that needs to be developed, and then there's these new capacities where regular commercial risks will increase to the tune of 300 billion on an operating level. But then there's still a remaining risk of supply chain disruptions. Again, these are what I show here on the left side of that chart. And for those remaining risks, insurance, there's risk transfer solutions through business interruption and contingent business interruption insurance. Some of those, if you look at the risks on the left, not all of them are physical risks. So traditional policies are not the match then. So non-damage business interruption plays in here, or specific supply chain insurance. They often are then on parametric basis, and so there's specific solutions available for the broad range of risks that are exposures that are listed here on the left side. There are political risk covers, and they can relate to the risk of the political risk of expropriation, government intervention, but then also currency convertibility risks. So again, non-physical type of risk exposures, and then there are also regulatory impairment covers, and they play a particular role, for example, for pharmaceutical industry. What we have seen out of COVID, and where we have seen the governments stepping in and changing the ability to produce and export, but then also it's an industry that is highly dependent on government on regulation and approvals, and so there's covers very specific to this type of exposure. So there are two ways of reacting. We talked very much about this risk mitigation, making the supply chain itself more resilient, and this has impact on GDP, requires a lot of investment, and has a lot of insurance implications coming out of this. But then there is also risk transfer for the remainder of risks as a way of a tool to transfer the remaining supply chain risks. So this is my sum up here. These trends that shape the changes in the supply chain have been going on for a while. Some of them economic, some of them political, geopolitical, and COVID and the U.S. China trade tensions, they are really accelerating. There is a big transition. We have run a scenario with some $1 trillion changes to GDP to other countries, and this will have insurance implications. We estimate that some $63 billion of new insurance demand comes out of this during a transition period in these new countries. This is done with the purpose of making the supply chain, global manufacturing, more resilient. That comes with a price. So adding the redundancies and moving away from the most efficient possible production means that some of these processes, business models, are more expensive, and this can lower the growth potential and increase prices to marginally in the long run. So while we quantify these positive effects here for this transition period, there is a longer term negative effect on growth and growth potential for the benefit of adding more resilience. And with that, I close here my remarks. Thank you, and I'm passing back to Chris to deal with the questions that I hopefully have by now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Thomas. That was fantastic. Really, we hear about this topic from our customers and brokers all the time. So this is extremely timely and very informative. In fact, we had polled in a previous webinar earlier in the year around topics of interest, and this turned out to be one of the top 2 areas of interest. So the timing and the ability to dive kind of deep into macro trends and the impacts and acceleration due to COVID is tremendous, so thanks for that. Before we get into Q&A, I just want to talk about some of our upcoming webinars. Next week on our October 21st, Scott Carpenteri, who's a regular guest on the series, will take a deep dive into non-physical damage business interruption case studies. That's a follow-up to a webinar which kind of outlaid the foundation for non-physical damage NDBI covers. So now we're just going to, next week, on the 21st, we're going to dive into specifics there. Then on November 10th, we'll host a webinar titled Emerging Risks, Black Swan or Risk Radar for the Future. That is a look into the key findings from Swiss Re's Sonar report, which is issued annually and identifies emerging risk trends and drivers. So keep an eye out for invitations for those. Please also watch the Swiss Re Corporate Solution LinkedIn feed for additional updates there. So Thomas, let's get into some of the Q&A here. We have a question on how will new technology affect supply chain risk and resiliency?
Sure. Yeah. So that has a has a couple of aspects how this plays in. So for once, technology is new manufacturing technology is enabling a move away from these the pure economy of scale oriented offshoring model, and robotics have a lot of the robotics have the benefit of being very flexible in the production. So 3D printing is one aspect of it, but a lot of the modern assembly plants are much more flexible in terms of producing different types of products and creating more flexibility, allowing much smaller lots of production, and being able to be more reactive to client demand. This is something which then makes it very attractive to or enables to be closer to the client. If you tailor-made production and is something where then a very quick turnaround time is also beneficial. You don't produce for inventory and for a more anonymous mass distribution, but it becomes tailor-made and very specific. And so at the same time, robotics are substituting labor, and labor costs play less of a role. And all this allows for manufacturing to be close to home, to the customer, and also be not necessarily in a low wage country. So this allows reshoring or nearshoring, and that's clearly a trend. Again, has been going on for a while, but it's enabling an enabled trend that will allow for some of the reshoring. But then also for it will also happen in these other lower cost locations. We also see investment in robotics there, but the flexibility is another aspect of adding resilience, because it allows a change in or flexible change in plans, and different plants can step in for each other and take over productions that are disrupted for whatever reason possible. Another aspect of technology is that's relevant for supply chain is the inclusion of sensors and creation of the availability of having much more data about supply, the flow of the supply chain, of the flow of goods, and technology allows us to create transparency about interactions and multi-step subcontracting relationships, for example, that are otherwise intransparent and therefore increasing the risk. Yeah, so technology allows us to better understand the risk, and therefore also being better able to manage the risk. And then finally, all this data, of course, is again creating risk in terms of cyber exposures, and having a lot of data and having it exchanged between players is a risk unless we manage to manage the security.
Thanks, Thomas. And speaking of new risks, the next question is, are there new risks introduced by manufacturers speeding up the development of parallel supply chains?
Yeah. So one I just mentioned that was that's the cyber risk. Yeah, but so we talk about the scenario of shifting production in different countries, and so if you think about this issue of transparency, the relocation is changing the current network, yeah, and so or the current chain of the current interconnectivities and the multi-tier system of suppliers. You add a lot of changes to that. So during the transition, actually, there's the risk that we at the end of the supply chain and for risk management, but then also for risk transfer questions, we actually understand less where things come from because these locations and the players involved change. The other risk that's being added are the engineering or the construction and engineering risk related to creating these new capacities. So we built factories in new countries. Some of those are not as developed in terms of manufacturing hubs as we have them developed over decades in China. So you have probably large manufacturing construction projects in countries with less experience, maybe of the scale of these projects. There's often the infrastructure is not as well developed. So these are all areas that will come with time, but during the transition time, we will have exposures and probably higher risks than in setting up new factories than they would have been in China or in the home material economies.
Thomas, thank you so much. That's all the time we have today. I want to, as always, thank you for being a great audience and spending the last hour with us. We hope you found that to be informative. And if you have questions or any follow-ups, feel free to reach out to Thomas or me. We'd love to continue the dialogue with you. In the coming days, we'll send a recording of this webinar, so feel free to share that with any colleagues or rewatch at your convenience. And really, that is all for today. Thanks again to our speaker, Dr. Thomas Holzoi, and again to you, the audience. And I wish you a great rest of the week.
Thank you from my side as well.